In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. On behalf of the Risala Foundation and the Islamic Society of Greater Houston, I'd like to welcome you. My name is Rehan Farouk. I have the pleasure of being your host this evening, and seated up here with me is Eli Clifton, our keynote speaker today. First, I want to thank you all for your patience. I take it you took a very circuitous route to Sugar Land today, so hopefully you saw the scenery, and of course there's nothing to see in Houston, so you saw that. But we're so grateful that you're here. We're grateful that you all were so patient and stuck through this with us. I'd also, before I get started, I want to thank the hosts for this evening, which is the Maryam Islamic Center and the Islamic Society of Greater Houston. Thank you for opening your doors to us for this very important event. Also, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our friends and neighbors, our brothers and sisters in humanity, particularly those for whom this marks your first visit to this venue. We are honored by your presence and hope that this is not the last time that you will visit us. If we can do anything to make your visit here more comfortable, if you have any questions, feel free to ask any of us who look sort of like of a brown tone. I'm sure they'll be able to point you in the right direction, although that doesn't generally specifically apply to everyone here. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to a few folks here, particularly from Germany, our delegates from Germany. Thank you for making the trip here from Germany. Welcome. We appreciate you being here. Also, a very warm welcome to John Healy, Fort Bend District Attorney, who's seated right here in the front. Thank you for being here. And Gary Gielan, City of Richmond Commissioner, former chairman of the Fort Bend Republican Party. It means a lot to us that you're out here. It really does. Today's format is pretty straightforward. In a few moments, Eli will give his presentation for about 40 minutes or so. It'll be preceded by a video presentation. We will then invite our special guest from Germany, Dr. Grumke, to come up here and address the audience as well. So on to today's topic, Fear Inc., the rise of the Islamophobia network in America. On October 26th of this year, in this city, a person by the name of Pamela Geller spoke to a gathering of fellow residents at the Sugar Land Convention Center. She began her speech by saying, "Welcome to the battlefield, welcome to the war." She proceeded to say to our friends and neighbors right here in Sugar Land that there is an Islamicization of the workplace going on. There is an Islamicization of our schools, and that there is an Islamicization of the public school curriculum. This type of rhetoric prompted Time magazine last year to put on its cover a question. They asked, "Is America Islamophobic?" If you read the first few lines of that article, the author wrote the following: "To experience what it feels like to be a Muslim in America today, walk in the shoes of Dr. Mansour Mirza of Sheboygan County, Wisconsin. It's a February evening, and you're at a meeting of the Planning Commission of Wilson, population 3,200, which is considering your application to open a mosque in the nearby village of Oostburg. You're not expecting much opposition. You own the land, you own the property, and you've worked at the nearby Manitowoc Hospital for years. You're hardly a stranger to the town. Indeed, some of the people at the meetings are like most of your patients, white Americans who don't seem to care about their doctor's race or creed when they talk to them about their illnesses. But when the floor is open to discussion, you hear things that they would never say to you even in the privacy of the examination room. One after another, they pour scorn and hostility upon your proposal. Most of the objections have nothing to do with zoning regulations. It's about your faith. Islam is a religion of hate, they say. Muslims are out to wipe Christianity, they say. There are 20 jihadi training camps hidden across rural America, they say, busy now producing the next wave of terrorists. Muslims murder their children, they say. Christian kids have enough problems with drugs and alcohol, and we should not have to worry about the Muslim problem. One of them says, "I don't want it in my backyard." Another one says, "I just think it's not America." So what drives this kind of naked fear, this kind of antagonism? Why do otherwise good-natured, genial, intelligent people act so irrationally? What is behind, or who is behind this all-out smear campaign? Well, Eli Clifton is here to answer some of those questions today. Due to his fearless and tireless work alongside his team consisting of Wajahat Ali, Matthew Duss, Lee Fang, Scott Keys, and Faz Shakir, Eli and his team have put together an expose of what they call the Islamophobia network. If sunlight is the best disinfectant, then Fear Inc. marks the first serious effort to sanitize our national dialogue. Eli Clifton is a national security reporter for thinkprogress.org at the Center for American Progress. He holds a bachelor's degree from Bates College and a master's degree in international political economy from the London School of Economics. He previously reported on U.S. foreign policy for the Inner Press Service, where he served as Deputy Washington Bureau Chief. His work has appeared on PBS's Frontline, the South China Morning Post, Right Web, Asia Times, lowblog.com, and foreignpolicy.com. So Eli, I've been told that this is your first visit to Texas. So how are you liking it so far?
So far, so good.
So there's three things you need to know about Houston. We're known for being the oil and gas capital of the country. We're the fourth largest city, and in honor of our governor, I can't remember the third one. With that, I'll give it to Eli Clifton. There you go.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having us and for being so patient. It's nice to be here for an audience that's, I think, interested in the report, because just last Friday I was in Nashville covering the anti-Sharia conference there, and the welcome I got was not like this. Turns out I'm not a friend of theirs. In deciding to do this report, I think the thing that struck all of us who were authors on it is that these people were not strangers to us. The folks who you saw in those video clips and who seemed to be suddenly rising to prominence around the Cordoba initiative, which they renamed the Ground Zero Mosque, were all familiar characters for those of us that had kind of been tracking this. And as I've been telling our German delegation here, we all kind of made a conscious effort not to talk about them, because the truth of the matter is they were on the fringes, and we didn't really see it as beneficial to give them the bully pulpit in any way. But something really dramatic happened a year ago, I guess. And suddenly these people were on Fox News, they were even on CNN, the New York Times was writing about them. You had local anti-Sharia initiatives spouting up around the country in areas where it wasn't like there was a dramatic influx of Muslim immigrants. It seemed to be, it was an odd mix of things that was occurring. And there was a hijacking of local communities, both in Sugarland, but also in like Murfreesboro in Tennessee, where suddenly these were becoming positions that local politicians running for offices that most of us maybe even haven't even heard of were taking positions against Islam and against Muslims. So I think that's what drew us to wanting to write this report, of saying, well, how did this happen? It doesn't seem like it was organic. It doesn't seem like it really was grassroots. It happened awfully fast. And it happened from people who we were kind of aware of, but never really wanted to call too much attention to. So it's kind of small up there, but I'll try to hit some of the big things here, because numbers, people like numbers, and I'm the numbers guy for this report. So some fast facts about the Islamophobia Network. 7 foundations we identified as contributing a large sum of money over the past 10 years to the individuals and institutions which have played a large role in promoting this fear of Islam in America and of Muslim Americans, and basically generating this Sharia threat. They contributed more than $40 million over the past 10 years. So there was a lot of money behind it, but a relatively small number of individuals and foundations. So 7 foundations, $40 million. 5 key misinformation experts that we've identified, some of whom you've actually seen up there, and I'm going to go over each of them briefly in a moment, sort of spearheaded the supposed academic research that was done showing that Muslim Americans were trying to perpetuate some sort of a seditious campaign within the United States. And this movement has had a really broad reach in a relatively small amount of time. It's reached 23 states. There have been attempts to put anti-Sharia initiatives on the ballots, and in some cases they've been more successful than others. But these experts their reach goes further than just local campaigns. Perhaps the thing that's flown under the radar the most is the fact that they are actually cited by the FBI and even some of the military intelligence work on this as experts on Islam. And they perpetuate this notion of a clash of civilizations, which sounds actually more similar to Al-Qaeda than to perhaps the reality or the way that we should be looking at this as a law enforcement problem facing terrorism. So they've played a very formative role in grasping this and reaching out in different directions, both toward the media, but also within law enforcement and within the government. And the impact has been real. A September 2010 Washington Post ABC poll showed that 49% of Americans held an unfavorable view of Islam. Now, I guess that statistic on its own isn't that interesting, except that in 2002, only 39% of Americans held an unfavorable view of Islam. Now, you would think that that number would have spiked after 9/11, but it turns out that it came 9 years later. So there's some interesting questions here about why public opinion has been changing in such a great direction. But to go back to what I said before, it is a national security threat, this type of a discussion and this type of a portrayal of Islam as at war with the West, because it buys into Al-Qaeda's narrative. It's problematic at two levels. One, in that it basically engages Al-Qaeda at the level they want to be engaged at, but perhaps even more importantly, it tears at the fabric of American society. That this is not the way that we have been taught to treat other religious groups, and that we aren't supposed to hold religious groups to a different standard than we would want to hold ourselves. The definition of Islamophobia that we use for the report, and it is sort of a new term, is defined as an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility toward Islam and Muslims that is perpetuated by negative stereotypes, resulting in bias, discrimination, and the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from American political and social and civic life. There's some disagreement over the term Islamophobia. There's disagreement about whether it even exists. I can tell you at the conference I was at on Friday, we were probably the only people there that believed it actually does exist. But it's an important term to get out there, and it's an important term that we use it because it identifies that it's a problem. So let's look at some more of the numbers that show the network's influence over the past several years. Once again, kind of hard to see here, so I'll try to read off some of these. But the important takeaway from these graphs is that right-wing media has given a megaphone to this movement. This movement existed before. They were bloggers. They had institutions in Washington, D.C. They didn't have the megaphone they have now. And what this shows, what these charts show, is that the highest bar on each of these are for Fox News viewers. And this is attitudes toward American Muslims by trusted media sources. 52% of Fox viewers believe that Muslims want to establish Sharia law, whereas the general public would say only 30% would say that, which isn't a good number, but it's considerably less. American Muslims are not an important part of the U.S. religious community. 60% of Fox News viewers agree with that, 43% of the general public. And the values of Islam are at odds with American values. 68% of Fox News viewers believe that. That isn't to put all the blame on Fox News, but it's played an important role in this sort of perfect storm we've seen because they've given a voice and they've given a platform to people who really want to spread this message. More numbers. I'm big on the numbers. Muslim Americans report they've become targets. It goes back to the fact that this has actually been a growing problem since 9/11. It didn't just spike in 2002. It's actually gone up considerably since then. And a new statistic this week said hate crimes against Muslims are up 50%. And that's actually an important one to remember because, surprisingly, actually a lot of the people who talk about the dangers of Sharia and are these anti-Muslim advocates actually deny that there are hate crimes against Muslims. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but it's actually an important fact and one that's really important to emphasize, that hate crimes do exist, they do occur against Muslims, and they've actually gone up. Putting it all together, wow, that's really hard to see. You just have to take my word for it, what I'm going to tell you here. So basically, we've tried to chart it out into a group, sort of compartmentalizing this movement and how it's become so effective. And it wouldn't be as effective without each of these individual parts. So when we say follow the money, I like to follow the money, but it wouldn't be as effective without the other parts as well. But to start with, we have the funders. I'm going to go into those in a moment. They contribute money to the misinformation experts, who are largely based at Washington, D.C. think tanks, or are portraying themselves as scholars and have some degree of academic accreditation, although some of that's questionable. But they claim to that. They write books. Some of them have New York Times bestsellers. And they use this platform to influence the grassroots movements, which is then feeds right into the Islamophobia echo chamber, which is comprised of the religious right, the media, the grassroots organizations, and the political players. And this is all an outline of sort of what I'm going to be covering and how this all comes together. The funding. So the Donors Capital Fund, the top one, with $20 million, is actually, although it's the biggest donor, it's the hardest for us to really say anything about, because they're what's known as a donor-advised fund. They take money from people, and they send the money where people want it to be sent. And there's a number of motivations for why somebody might want to engage in that. Anonymity would definitely be one of them. But $20 million they contributed over the past 10 years. Nearly 18 million of that, though, went to an organization called the Clarion Fund. And the Clarion Fund possibly has played an outsized role, bigger than any other organization we've talked about here, in influencing the public discussion about Islam in America. Because the Clarion Fund produced a documentary called Obsession: Radical Islam's War Against the West. And this documentary, which was widely panned by critics, and basically everybody that looked at it in an objective way said that it was hate speech, that didn't slow it down, because they had $18 million to promote this movie. The movie probably cost less than $1 million to make. But they mailed it to 28 million swing state voters before the 2008 presidential election, and they inserted it in newspapers. And I think that this probably was the beginning of what we've seen of sort of the modern Islamophobia, anti-Muslim movement in the US. That, yes, it's been going on, but this marked when it became clear there was some really serious money behind it, and that it was willing to get engaged in the daily political battles. And of course, this was at the same time that people were starting to raise questions about whether Barack Obama was a Muslim, whether he was a Muslim sympathizer. It was sort of a perfect storm. So the Clarion Fund, the Donors Capital and the Clarion Fund played a very big role in that. Donors Capital also has contributed money to the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which is Steve Emerson's front group, the Middle East Forum, which is Daniel Pipes, and David Horowitz's Freedom Center, which funds Robert Spencer and Jihad Watch. I'm not going to cover all of the donors, but I do think Richard Scaife and Lyndon Harry Bradley are important. Richard Scaife, based in Pittsburgh, there's 3 foundations that he operates. Very much an institution within the American right and within the American philanthropy on the right, and has been a big proponent of sort of trying to find boogeymen and promoting that image. He was actually played quite a large role in the Vince Foster conspiracy theories. I don't know how many of you remember that from the first term of the Clinton administration, trying to suggest that somehow Vince Foster had been murdered instead of committing suicide, as all evidence suggested. And Richard Scaife also owns the local paper in Pittsburgh, so he has a media megaphone that he can use accordingly, and he put $7.8 million into this network. Last one I'm going to talk about, Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation. They also real mainstays of the American right and their involvement. They've been very generous with just 3 of the foundations we looked at, the Middle East Forum, the Center for Security Policy, which is Frank Gaffney, and David Horowitz again. So now we'll look at who are the experts in this movement, the people that the media turns to and says that these people are going to tell you about Islam on Sunday morning. And note the number of times as we go through this that these experts were cited by Anders Breivik, the Oslo shooter, the Norwegian terrorist who killed over 70 people, because it's actually kind of disturbing to notice that. Frank Gaffney, he's an old Cold Warrior, and he found a new enemy with Muslim Americans. He used to be the one always warning that the communists were coming, or that the Soviet Union was planning a surprise nuclear attack on the U.S. And he kind of had to change his tone in the early 90s, as you might understand. But he shifted it over rather quickly. He did okay. And he founded the Center for Security Policy. And in 1988, it was not focusing on Muslims, it was focusing on the Soviet Union, but once again, he transitioned that pretty well. They lean towards sort of a neoconservative view, and Gaffney really does play a leadership role in being one of the most outspoken voices at his institution condemning Muslims. And Anders Breivik cited CSP, his foundation, and Gaffney 7 times in his manifesto. So whether Gaffney endorses Breivik's actions or not, he clearly played an inspirational role, as did a number of these people. And as we've said, money does play a role here, and CSP has received quite a bit of money. It's received $20 million in revenue between 2002 and 2009. So although it's easy to say that they're on the fringes, they were on the fringes during the Cold War, they're on the fringes now, there's some money behind him, and that's what's given him influence. A key quote from him: "A mosque that is used to promote a seditious program, which is what Sharia is, that is not a protected religious practice, that is in fact sedition." And I just want to add about Frank Gaffney. I ran into him on Friday, and I was with another co-author of this report, Li Fan, and we were walking into the conference, and we saw Frank Gaffney walking in ahead of us alone. We knew he was going to speak, and we had a discussion between us. We said, should we sort of do an ambush interview? Should we walk up to him and... We said, no, that doesn't seem like the very professional, the nice thing to do. We're going to wait until, So we walked up to him inside the venue, and we said, Mr. Gaffney, and Undersecretary Gaffney, he was former Undersecretary of Defense, do you think we could interview you? And he said, yeah, sure. I'm going to give my talk. I need to prepare for my talk. I'll speak with you. And we really wanted to talk to him because on his radio show he had said that we were in cahoots with the Muslim Brotherhood when we wrote our report. So we really wanted to know about that. And after his talk, he sat down and started to sign copies of his book or his report, Team B Part 2. And a woman representing the event checked in with us and said, yes, Mr. Gaffney will talk with you afterwards when he's done. So we politely stood by. And as he finished signing them, he beckoned, and 5 bodyguards with bulletproof jackets surrounded him, and he stood up and walked him out to his car and left. So it was kind of a harsh way of saying no comment. But he doesn't want to talk to us, is what we found out. He doesn't like this. David Yerushalmi, on the other hand, flies far more under the radar than Frank Gaffney, although they're very closely intertwined. David Yerushalmi, his organization is the Society of Americans for National Existence, which you probably haven't heard of either, nor necessarily should you, but he's the architect of a lot of the Sharia legislation. And when I say he's the architect of it, I mean if you actually look at the legislation that people try to pass around the country, it's actually word for word written by him, most of it. And it's not that he's individually writing each one, it's that they're copying legislation that he's written in the past. But he's worked as a consultant for the Center for Security Policy with Frank Gaffney. He's the co-author of Center for Security Policy's Sharia, the Threat to America report, which is where they draw a lot of the language for the Sharia legislation. Excuse me. And he serves as a legal counsel for Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, who I think are more familiar names. He's received $250,000 from the Center for Security Policy purely for his consulting work on Sharia, the Threat to America, and various other projects. And his society and his organization has pulled in $385,000 in revenue in 2007 and about the same amount in 2008 and 2009. It's a newer organization. But a key quote from him: Muslim civilization is at war with Judeo-Christian civilization. The Muslim people, those committed to Islam as we know it today, are our enemies. Both the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League have also expressed concern about his not just anti-Muslim but anti-black comments. He referred to African Americans as a murderous breed who are killing themselves. But these are the types of things that don't get as much attention, and David Yerushalmi stays largely behind the scenes in this, although you'll see his name pop up when he's working with the Center for Security Policy, which is often the only time you'll see him. But the movement, it's moving beyond just Center for David Yerushalmi's organization in Arizona or the Center for Security Policy in D.C. As you can see, it's gone to 23 states, and it's expanding, and there's no reason to believe that it's actually going to decrease the number of states that will attempt to pass some sort of anti-Sharia legislation. The laws vary. Many focus on family law, and the truth is that none of them really add much new to existing laws. But what they do is they explicitly talk about Muslims and Islam. For instance, laws about domestic violence now will have explicit references to Muslims in it. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense when you actually start talking with the people about what they expect to accomplish, other than that they're trying to just call attention to Muslims or Muslims who choose to break the law. And often it gets very explicit. For instance, they'll talk about genital mutilation, domestic violence. These are their favorite topic areas that they like to target these legislation at. And clearly it's offensive, it's disturbing, but when you take a step back, you realize that the only reason you would pass this is to try to smear a specific group, as opposed to actually dealing with a problem of violence or a social problem. I'm not a lawyer, though, so if there are any lawyers here, I'm sure they can offer far more detail. Daniel Pipes is probably one of the more high-profile and, for lack of a better term, best respected anti-Muslim advocates. His father was a Cold Warrior, if there's a connection there. But he's been pretty consistent about targeting Muslims and Muslim Americans since the 1990s. His organization is Middle East Forum, which is based in Philadelphia, and it's received millions of dollars in funding. Donors Capital gave it $2.3 million. The Bradley Foundation, $305,000. It's one of the. It has the veneer of academic legitimacy in a way that few of these other ones do. But when you actually get into what Daniel Pipes writes, it's pretty bigoted. A key quote from him: "All immigrants bring exotic customs and attitudes, but Muslim customs are more troublesome than most." So Pipes has I think, as some of his critics have pointed out, he actually could come off as very reasonable, except for the fact that if you ever press him to say anything nice about Islam, he's suddenly at a loss. And the criticisms he makes of Islam are perhaps unfair, but would be seen more balanced if he ever criticized any other religion, which he doesn't do. And clearly Anders Breivik, once again, took some inspiration here. He cited Pipes and the Middle East Project 18 times in his manifesto. So whether Pipes endorsed the violence or not, I would say it clearly has had a role in inspiring some people to take very, very extreme actions. And if we're talking about Anders Breivik, really Robert Spencer is the person who will really be ashamed to overlook, because his organization that he runs with Pamela Geller, Stop Islamization of America, and his blog, Jihad Watch, was cited 162 times by Anders Breivik, which I believe made him one of the most cited sources in Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto. Spencer has had success professionally in his anti-Muslim crusade. He has a New York Times bestseller with The Truth About Muhammad. And perhaps more disturbingly, and this goes back to what I was saying about law enforcement, Spencer's work has repeatedly shown up in FBI training materials, as well as Department of Homeland Security training materials, and research done through the Defense Department, especially at the Army War College. And this is disturbing stuff, because Spencer is a big proponent of the notion of a war of civilizations, and it's shocking to see that this type of a portrayal of religion and of different groups in America actually gets read and absorbed at such high levels. And especially for Spencer, who doesn't really have like a foundation behind him, it's rather interesting to see that he's done this pretty much sheer through his own popularity, through his books that have sold well, and as a result, people assume there must be something to what he's saying, and you see it showing up on suggested reading lists at places where you really shouldn't be finding that, or in the FBI's Academy's library, as Wired magazine's Spencer Ackerman found. It doesn't take much money to keep Robert Spencer on the road either. In 2005 and 2006, the Fairbrook Foundation contributed $250,000 to Jihad Watch. And it seems as if he pulls in about $130,000 personally from the David Horowitz Foundation. So I think it's important to put this in context. Money isn't necessarily the defining quality of whether these people are influential or not, because somebody like Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller, well, they have a blog. They don't need a lot of money. And Robert Spencer has an outsized influence, considering the relatively small amount of money it takes to make him effective. A key quote from him: "Of course, as I have pointed out many times, traditional Islam is not moderate or peaceful. It is the only major world religion with a developed doctrine and tradition of warfare against unbelievers." Finally, Steve Emerson, the Investigative Project on Terrorism. This is somebody who you would have thought would have lost all legitimacy after the Oklahoma City bombings, when he said that it had, Muslim characteristics or something along those lines. But he's rebounded from that horrible misstatement of events. And he runs the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which claims to be one of the world's largest storehouses of archival data and intelligence on Islamic and Middle Eastern terrorist groups. That still hasn't really diminished the fact that he's still best known for having really called it wrong on Oklahoma City. But he receives a lot of money, and IPC received a total of $400,000 from the Donors Capital Fund in 2008 and 2007. And as well as $100,000 from the Becker Foundation and $250,000 from Daniel Pipe's Middle East Foundation. So it's somewhat incestual, you'll see. And Emerson, as if Emerson doesn't have enough problems, his foundation, the Investigative Project on Terrorism, turns around and gives all of its revenue to his private company, SAE Productions, where we don't know where the money goes. He says he does it for security reasons, but other experts think it might be less than on the level. And as a key quote from Emerson: "Of course, as I have pointed out many times, traditional Islam itself is not moderate or peaceful. It is the only major world religion with a developed doctrine and tradition of warfare against unbelievers." But as we showed in the video about half an hour ago, I am optimistic that this is a movement that perhaps has peaked or will peak soon. Herman Cain has already flip-flopped on it, I guess twice now. First he said he wouldn't have a Muslim in his cabinet, and then he said that that was wrong and that he would have a Muslim in his cabinet. Then I guess today he said that the Muslim communities are full of radicals, so we don't know where he stands. It's true of a lot of other things as well. Mitt Romney since actually said similar statements in 2007 about Muslims or Islam in America posing a security threat, but he hasn't talked about it since 2007, which I think is indicative of the fact that he doesn't want to touch this as the GOP frontrunner. So I think that's a positive sign. And the darling of the GOP, although he's, to their disappointment, not running, Chris Christie, as we can see, has certainly taken his stance against it in quite clear terms. So I think that as we look at the Islamophobia network and as we see these campaigns, it's important not to engage it at the level of this battle of civilizations that Robert Spencer or Daniel Pipes so want to discuss it at. Because that's a very tough discussion to have and one that really just leads nowhere. I think the more powerful way of looking at it is that we've seen this before in America. This is not unique. It's not unique to Muslims. It's not a unique thing we're seeing occurring. It's not special. It is unacceptable, but we've dealt with it before. We've dealt with it with Catholics. We've dealt with it with Italian Americans. We've dealt with it with Irish Catholics. We've dealt with it with Japanese Americans. We've dealt with it with Jews. We saw it in the McCarthy hearings. And in all of these cases, when people look back on it, there's very few people that defend it. There's very few people that stand by and say, well, maybe they had a point with interning the Japanese. That's not the way it works. And it's not a partisan issue. It's not like where you'll have one party saying that they interpret history this way and the other party interprets it this way. It's pretty clean cut. And I think that the more we shed light on this and the more we engage it as, an example of American intolerance and bigotry and the type of thing we've seen before, and hopefully we can deal with it faster than how we've dealt with these things in the past, the better we'll be able to defeat this. Finally, and actually my favorite part, although talking to friendly audiences is pretty cool too, I really like seeing how they respond to us. I don't know if you can read it up there, but David Horowitz has responded to this report as Think Progress, an organization created by George Soros and the Clintons, has joined the Muslim Brotherhood, the Hamas spin-off CARE, and assorted Marxist groups in issuing a report on, quote, Islamophobia. Robert Spencer said it revealed us to be just another tool of those same jihadists. Daniel Pipes says it neatly falls into lockstep with the efforts being exerted by the Muslim Brotherhood front groups to incrementally Islamize the West. Pamela Geller said it was a pile of dung masquerading as research that reads more like a Mein Kampf treatise. And actually, that's not the best quote from her, because she also said we should choke on our own vomit. And Fox Business Network's Eric Balling inaccurately made up a quote about us saying that we blamed it all on a small group of Jews and Israel supporters. So the really intriguing thing is that the issues they have with our report, and in interviewing people on Friday who didn't like our report, they don't like the conclusions. They don't like, ultimately, what we're trying to show. But we've actually had very few attacks on the content or the facts, which we've tried to clearly cite in the report. So I'm going to take that as a sign that at least hopefully we got some of it right, that we did lay out some of what this network is comprised of. If I've missed out on anything, it's because the report is actually really long. I think we have copies here. It's 139 pages. I'd encourage you all to look at it. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. So by the way, how do you like our mosque?
Beautiful.
Good. Is it the best mosque you've been to so far? You have to say yes.
In Houston, yes.
You should run for political office. That was very good.
I should have said I forgot.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. And we're going to open it up for questions and answers right after Dr. Drumke's address. So now I'd like to invite up to the stage Dr. Thomas Grumke. For almost 2 decades, he has been a researcher and scholar on various social and cultural issues. His expertise ranges from literature and German history to his eminent studies in right-wing extremism. Dr. Drumke has taught and lectured in political science and social science at respected institutions across Germany. Since 2004, he has worked as a specialist on right-wing extremism at the Agency for the Protection of the Constitution at the Interior Ministry of the State of Nordrhein-Westfalen. I hope I pronounced that right. As an internationally recognized subject matter expert, he is responsible for monitoring and reporting on instances of right-wing neo-Nazi and supremacist ideologies to the highest levels of the German government. Dr. Grumke, if you could please join us up here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. This comes a little bit as a surprise for me that I'm up here now. But that's, of course, I'm very happy to do that. As was mentioned, I'm part of a German delegation that came here to Houston 3 days ago, and we are here actually to learn from our American counterparts how to actually deal with these kind of questions that were just presented by Eli here. And maybe I should elaborate a little bit more on the work I'm doing. As was mentioned, I'm actually a civil servant. My background is in political science, but since 2004 I work for the Interior Ministry in Germany. And maybe for an American audience, it's important to know that in Germany the Interior Ministry is not only concerned with national parks, but it is actually usually one of the biggest ministries, and all the security agencies are under the roof of the Interior Ministry, like the police, and also the department that I'm working for, which can be translated as the Department for the Protection of the Constitution. And this is a very German institution, and I would say formally we are the equivalent of the American FBI, but no guns, okay? I'm not carrying a gun, and I don't have any intention to do that. So it is a very civil organization. So only technically we would be like the German FBI. But as a matter of fact, the work we are doing as a government agency is actually the work that people like Eli here is doing, or the Anti-Defamation League is doing, or the Southern Poverty Law Center is doing, so all non-governmental organizations. So you can see already that the role of the government in Germany is so much more prominent. So the monitoring work or this kind of presentation that we just saw, that's usually part of my work. Yeah? So as a representative of the largest state of the 16 German states, a big part of my work is putting together presentations like this, to any audience that actually is interested in it. But also what we do, we initiate educational work. So we work a lot with police, with law enforcement, with teachers, which is a big part of our work, so that these facts are known. So the underlying idea, which of course can only be understood if you know recent German history, that the German history is of course quite traumatic, let's say, when it comes to the knowledge that we had a short phase of a democratic system, which then what we call was a defenseless democracy. So it was a democratic system which was not able to defend itself against its enemies. And that's something that we believe should not happen anymore. So we call ourselves the German democratic system. We now today call ourselves, we are not a defenseless, but a militant democracy, which maybe is not the most perfect translation of the German, but I think it's the closest you can get. So we, like the department that I work for, is a department which was founded after the Second World War, of course, and we have a very specific part in this concept of militant democracy. So the work we are doing is putting together a yearly report, first of all for the parliament, but also for the general public, where we basically expose every and all groups, sometimes individuals, and any kind of activity that we see in our state that we think is extremist. That's in Germany the word, extremist, which means working actively against the democratic system, the democratic order, and anything that would also incite hate. So my work personally, I'm responsible for doing this and analyzing the right-wing extremist part. So neo-Nazis, skinheads, I'm sure you're all familiar with that crowd. So also what I'm concerned with is the crowd you have heard about today. And I can tell you that this is of course very interesting to me also, and because this has been giving us a lot of headache in Germany as well. It is true that Islamophobia, as both as an ideological framework but also as a political tool, has gained ground in Europe, in Germany also. And I make this distinction because Islamophobia is not only part of a right-wing ideology, but it is also used by quite a few groups as a tool, because they know in the general public this works. It simply works. It simply works. And it has been actually compared by some scholars to the way anti-Semitism used to work. So in Germany today, if you come with an anti-Semitic agenda, you are politically dead. You're not going to get far in elections. Nobody's going to want to listen to you. So these groups have moved on. And today what you do, and interestingly, some of these, the methods that are used, in this anti-Semitic rhetoric, are now used against Muslims. It's the same thing. They take something that belongs to us because we were here first. And I'm sure you know this whole thing. Having said that, I also want to mention that, of course, there are also very distinct differences. Our people that argue in this way, they don't have millions of dollars. There are no donors of this sort. They are broke. They have no money. It is amazing. And of course, I like to believe that this is also partly to the work we are doing, because I mean, we as a government every year say these kind of groups are political extremists, and we label them as such. There's a lot of media coverage on this, on the report we're doing every year. They sue us every year. We win every year. And so we like to keep it that way. I mean, of course, you have to understand this, the use of the word extremist in Germany, this is also a legal term almost. So we have to prove to a court, and of course there's always possible for every individual or every group that is mentioned in our report to challenge us in court, of course. And they do this every year. And so we have to prove every single year why we use that label. And fortunately, there are all these quotes in Germany also of these people. So they, fortunately, they always are very open about their goals. And so we usually we have an easy time to then prove in court why we call them extremists, and we win. So this is, I hope, part of the reason that there has not been such an electoral success of these groups in Germany at all. Quite unlikely if you look at other European countries. I mean, Germany is basically surrounded by countries where these groups that use this as a political tool, I don't even know if they are always deeply believe it themselves, but they think, rightly, that this is a tool where you can gain maybe 20-30% of the vote with this kind of rhetoric. So, of course, Belgium, Holland, the Scandinavian countries, Austria very prominently, now Hungary, Italy, they all have parties where they are in the 20-30, sometimes more percentage range, who sometimes don't argue. Usually they are a little bit more elegant than what we heard here, but it comes down to the same. It comes down pretty much to the same. So, maybe that's from my side, just to give you an idea. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.